Welcome to the Intelligent Business Show, a podcast from Aberdeen discussing the latest trends to keep you and your business at the top of your class. And now, here's your host, Aberdeen's CMO in residence, Matthew Grant.
Hello, and welcome to the Intelligent Business Show, the podcast that focuses on the ways that organizations just like yours are using data to make their business more intelligent. I'm your host, Matthew Grant, CMO in residence here at Aberdeen. This week on the show, we're speaking with Randy Frisch, CMO, co-founder, and president at Uberflip. Randy has a new book just out, F, Content Marketing, and we invited him to the show to talk about the book and the importance of the content experience. Let's dive in. So, Randy, welcome to the Intelligent Business Show.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to chat with you about this stuff.
No, I'm really glad that we have this opportunity. So we're going to jump right in. And specifically, content marketing, as we all know, has been around at least 10 years, or if you follow Joe Polizzi, going back to the turn of the last century. But what you've been writing about recently and talking about and what Uberflip has been focused on is not content marketing per se, but the growing importance of the content experience. So I was wondering, just as we start out here, if you could unpack that a little bit for us and what you mean by a content experience.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, Joe and Robert Rose as well over there at Content Marketing Institute, we're probably going through the same thing 10 plus years ago is, what the hell is this content marketing thing, right? And they were two words that we understood in on their own, content and marketing. The idea was what happens when we put it together. The same challenge I think we're having now. If I asked you, is experience important, for our customers, we'd all jump all over and say, of course it is, right? And, we all think about the retail experience if we're going into a brick and mortar type of store or online store, if that's the case, and we all think of the content we create. The content experience is simply, what is that experience when you encounter content on a day-to-day basis? Now, it's funny. Sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say something like, oh, yeah, I've heard of that. That sounds familiar, but that's kind of like a Q4 thing for us. It's like, we're not there now. We're going to deal with content experience in Q4 this year. And I'll say like, okay, that's great that you're going to deal with it then, but it doesn't mean that you don't have a content experience now. Like if you have content, it's how are people experiencing that content when it's encountered? And the reality is it's either a great experience, it's one that's helping you win deals, or, and tell me how profane I can be because I am sometimes. But, it's a shitty experience in that, we get to that content and it's good quality, right? Like we heard about, the quality versus quantity debate, right? Quality is more important. But if it's wrapped up inside of a terrible experience, we may not even take the time to consume it, right? We'll bounce off that page, or we won't go to the next piece of content that may even have been better than the first because we didn't show them a path to get there. These are all different considerations that come into play when we talk about content experience.
Yeah, no, I think that all makes sense. And oddly enough, it's reminding me of a talk that I gave at Marketing Profs, I want to say, at the B2B forum 4 or 5 years ago, maybe. It was focused on marketers and telling them what you don't know about UX might kill you. And oddly enough, I didn't call it what you're talking about, but what I was trying to get marketers to think about was in a sense, the user experience of the outbound marketing tactics they're using. And I think people, even marketers today, they don't think about just even like a UX person, thinking about even just an email that you're sending. What's the context in which a person's receiving this? When they read it, what's it going to be like? Even getting down to, is it easy to read? Is it hard to read? Is it too many, And so it's funny like that you talk about this because it is, I think it's critical and overlooked. And I think you're absolutely right to say, this isn't about creating a content experience as if you didn't have one before. It's about actually becoming mindful of when someone's interacting with your content, are you just having a transactional focus? Did they look at it? Did they click? Did they download? And that's really all you care about. And instead thinking about, So what's actually happening with this person when they're reading this, and what's a turnoff to them, and what's kind of engaging them and encouraging them to pursue things and explore things further?
It's interesting, Matt, because you hit on an interesting part right at the beginning of there when you talked about user experience, I think, is what you talked about at Marketing Profs. And I think last time you and I chatted, we both talked about how we love Anne, and everyone loves Anne. But, user experience is one of those words that I think a lot of us marketers, we kind of we cringe because we're like, fuck, am I responsible for that? Yeah. How am I, I'm not a user experience person. I need a UX designer to focus on experience. And in a way, we're kind of jumping, and I wrote a book on this. It's actually just come out. And in the third part of the book, we dig into this big question, which is who's going to own experience in your organization? Because it's not okay for us to sit there and say, well, that's the user experience designer, or that's my designer's problem, altogether. And I think that's a bit of a challenge, back to your question, what's the difference between content marketing and content experience? In reality, there shouldn't have been a difference, if you will, right? If you go back and you hit on Joe Paluzzi and Robert Rose, who I talked about, their original definitions of content marketing talked about how you're going to attract the audience and how you're going to acquire them, and how we're going to look into the data aspects of that I know we're going to talk about today. But they assumed that we wouldn't just look at content marketing as a creation strategy, right? And I think that's what's happened in a lot of our organizations, right? And it's kind of just reality that it happened that way. It wasn't meant to happen that way. It's how it unfolded. And I'll give you an example, which is if you look at a lot of the organizations where they have a job title now called content marketer, which didn't exist 10 plus years ago. But that content marketer in many cases used to be a journalist, right? Or used to be a very strong writer in some sort of way or another, who's come in to tell stories and define narrative, and write ebooks and perhaps compose videos. And those are all really important things, but what they don't touch on is how am I actually going to embed this into my marketing campaigns? How am I going to distribute this? How am I going to measure ROI and dig into the data? And there are some full stack content marketers who know how to do that, but for a lot of them, their strength is creation, not these other parts.
Right. And I think you've talked about, I know in your videos and things like that, let's face it, creating, and this is talking about, and good enough is not good enough anymore in content, and there should be this super focus on content quality and creating great content or content that blows people away, et cetera. That in and of itself obviously is a challenge and hard to do. But what happens is, I think the challenge there, the difficulty of doing that, ends up distracting people from the fact that, let's face it, we're not creating works of art. We're creating functional pieces of a larger program, right? Content created for content marketing it's motivated, we're trying to create a motivated experience that moves people in a certain direction, not just when you go to the museum and you walk around and afterwards you come out all spaced because everything was so beautiful. You want people to do something next. And that kind of stuff is hard to think about. And unfortunately, to your point earlier, we create this weird division of labor around it, that's the UX person's responsibility. Even though, on the other hand, we're saying, and everything we do, we're buyer-centric, we're customer-centric. We put the customer at the center of everything we do. And then you raise a question so what's that experience like when they go into your content library and can't find what they're looking for? Well, that's the UX person's got to deal with that. It's you're revealing a total disconnect in terms of how people think about this stuff, I think.
Absolutely, Matt. And, I know on this podcast you talk a lot about data. I think one of the things that, whether you call it a vanity metric, I'm not a big fan of that term because it just is what it is. It's more like, what do we fall back on, right? And from a content perspective, a lot of us, believe it or not, are still worried about how many shares we got or how many people read it. But to me, that's like sports, right? It's like, looking at a team who's got an amazing player who scored 50 goals if it's hockey, or hit, 60 home runs if they're, a baseball player. Pick your sport. But if at the end of the day, if that team didn't win, who cares? Right? Like, that person's season doesn't matter. They're not going to become the league MVP because that team didn't succeed. Right? And it's the same thing if we look at it from this perspective of all this content that we have. We have to be able to map how it leads us to success, right? How that goal or that person's ability to make those around them a little bit better and lead us to that next thing makes us better. Same thing with all this content, right? If someone watches one of our videos or reads one of our ebooks, let's not celebrate. Let's celebrate when we can show that path that says, okay, when they do that, the next step that they do is read another piece of content and another, or perhaps at some point request a demo of our solution or buy our service or whatever it is that we're trying to monetize, so that, as you said, we can drive that ROI.
Like I was saying before, the content that we create is part of a process that we're trying to get people to do something. And so that we get around then to like calls to action. And sometimes the call to action can be a recommendation of what to read next because we're trying to pull people in. So I was wondering, either in your research or just in your experience so far, what you think about how having this kind of an experience or content experience perspective can help people when it comes to designing and thinking about designing calls to action, or even the type of recommendation engine they're using on their site when you're trying to pull people farther into conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely some interesting data there. And let's make sure anyone listening understands what we mean when we say a call to action in this case. Because and I'll give you a couple of examples, and then I'll give you some really interesting data points and how we came about them. Let's look as an example at the traditional way that people have gated content forever, right? And that's a landing page, right? But the reality is landing pages were not built for content, right? Like, landing pages have essentially been around longer than content marketing has been at the level of hype it's at today. We used landing pages originally specifically for like landing, right? It was like an A/B test. Do we want to, have our homepage look like this or that, or, something of the sort? And we want to try and drive someone to some sort of conversion. And we ultimately, said, okay, well, let's try and use this, to convert on an ebook or something of that sort. And the problem there is, when we're looking for that ebook, and let's use an ebook, we can sub in for a video or some sort of other webinar type of premium asset that you're going to gate. I think a lot of us just assume that people are going to believe you that this thing behind this magic gate, first of all, will be there, and second of all, on demand, I should say, and second of all, that it is that great, right? And that people are going to actually want it in that moment, and that's a big thing for us to assume because for some of us, we end up kind of with that disappointment, right? A lot of us will use channels like LinkedIn or Facebook to kind of distribute some of this content, but there's a lot of free content on there. Yep. So what happens when someone gets there? Let's say someone clicks on your link there, they land on this page, and all of a sudden they're landing on this page where it's a landing page, right? They just got a feed of free content. What's to say that they're actually going to go in there and actually convert on the fly on that actual piece of content, right? Like it's a big assumption that we have there. So we have to be more clever, right? We have to, as marketers, we need to say, okay, well, what does this person expect? And how do I give it to them? And how do I assure them that it's going to be there? And what I meant by be there is, and Matt, I'm sure you've experienced terrible experiences like this. When it's like you fill out that form and then they're like, okay, go check your email because we just emailed you the report.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, that is so silly to me. It's just like, I want it right now. Like, why do I have to go change my channel, right? It's literally like my kids who can't understand cable television, right? Like they've grown up with Netflix and whatnot. And they don't understand that when they're done the show that they just watched, that they have to go to a guide to find another channel, or they have to wait a whole week for that next episode, right? In their mind, it's like, I just want to keep enjoying your content. Like that's what they want in that moment. Give them that opportunity to binge, if you will. So, back to your question, what we did was we did a study earlier this year, and I'm going to come to some of the things that are better in a moment, but I want to take a second just to set up how we did this study.
Okay.
A lot of us as marketers, we love surveys or focus groups or things like that. And there's a time and place for surveys and focus groups. I'm not going to say we don't do them or we're against them, but they're not always true, right? Because usually when we survey marketers, we'll kind of, fudge our opinion or fudge our results because we want to sound all smart and that we know everything that there is to know, right? Like I'm a CMO, I'll admit I do that myself, right? We talk up a big game, right? But what we realized that we could do is rather than survey people to understand what they were doing to focus on content experience, we could actually leverage data. Now, we took 440 organizations and we took all of the data from their content experience. When I say content experience, I'm talking about that front-facing experience that they put in front of customers and said, okay, well, what type of engagement do they get when they try different scenarios, right? So it's just like any A/B test, right, where we're going to have our hypothesis and we're going to have our outcome. And we went and we said, okay, well, what different variations that we may play with lead to different outcomes?
Right.
And the beauty was we had all this engagement data that was real data. So rather than having to ask anyone their opinion, we were able to leverage data. We brought in our AI division here at Uberflip, got those guys off product for a little bit to help our marketing team and help us interpret large subsets of data for how people consume content. And one of the most interesting results was tied to call to action. So that was your original question.
Yeah.
And what we found was, on average, I was telling you about the old way people did this with, landing pages. So we found some data on, traditional B2B space, using a landing page. What's the average conversion rate? And we saw an average conversion rate across the market of 2.35%. What's crazy is when people started to use what's more of like an overlay CTA, that one where it's just kind of a bit of a teaser and there's, some fields to fill in, but it's not a full page. Like the asset is right there and we're just using this overlay. You fill it out, we'll give you that asset. Yep. When they use that, they saw a 17% conversion rate, wow. Right? Like that's wild. 7 times more conversions on that content when we start to, just play with our old way of doing things.
Right. And so, first of all, I just wanted to be clear, the data that you guys were using to get these insights was the data that's generated on your platform. You weren't going out and asking people to share with you, hey, what are you guys doing? Where did that going? You were leveraging the data that's already just coming out of the platform that you guys provide, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we were leveraging aggregate data across our customer base. We don't, when we do these studies and we do this research, we don't provide any context to who the customers are, things like that. And it's all anonymous, but it helps us see trends. And we're able to feed that data back to our customers as well so that they can learn from each other, right? I mean, they're learning from the platform, but they're also learning from each other, which is this great opportunity to say, okay, well, why don't I try this or why don't I try something new and see if that theory holds the same for my approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I want to find out more about what you uncovered by sifting through this data and playing around with it. But I did just want to point out what's interesting nowadays is that, first of all, we just create a lot of data in the course of doing business, and particularly when you're a technology company such as Uberflip. But what people, I think, still, even though they go back to the old surveys and things like that, it's just highlighting what a kind of untapped asset that data can be that you yourself are just, like I said, capturing as part of the course of doing business.
Yeah, it's actually funny. I mean, it's funny you bring that up. So my co-founder and I, years ago in the early days, we were trying to raise money to start up the business and grow the business. And to be honest, we were terrible at that piece in the early days. We didn't raise any money until last year, but that ended up being a blessing, which is a whole other story. But one of the things that all these VCs would tell us is they're like, oh, so what's the data play, right? And we'd look at them and be like, what the fuck are you asking? Like, what do you mean? Like, we just showed you this amazing platform. Like, no, but there's going to be a lot of data there, and you can, some of them would tell us how we could sell that data or we could monetize that data. And, we always, we later, I will admit, we kind of felt guilty to the process and we started talking about the data play, but it was so far out on our roadmap.
Yeah.
And it's, I think that's shifted. I think a big part of what shifted that for a lot of organizations is the expectation to figure out how to build in AI functionality into our platforms, because that's moved us in a couple of directions that I think are really important. One, we are a content platform, and there is the most natural play ever for us to be able to recommend content on the fly.
Yep.
Which is really obvious. But the other thing that did was it brought in this talent into our organization, which we didn't previously have. Yes, we had really great marketing analyst type of individuals who would analyze, smaller subsets of data or stuff that Marketo, in our case, could spit out. But, we're talking about really large subsets of data where it helps to be able to bring in an actual data science team, which we now have. And, back when I was talking to VCs, we were like, all right, we'll figure that out down the road. Right. We're now at that point. And I think that a lot of companies would be surprised that they may be at that point now as well, right? Like if they've invested in data science or they're collecting these large, sets of data, and using backend platforms to maintain that, there may be opportunities for them to run, really interesting reports that come out of their own customer base.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We had a fellow on, Dan Scudder, who has a company that he just launched here last spring in Boston called Highland Math. And they're all about helping companies figure out how they can monetize or at least make liquid on some level their internal data assets. So it's like when you talk about VCs and looking for data plays, there's almost this natural, almost side business that could come up. Sometimes you can use it internally or to create content. But like one of the things we were talking about is, since you'd mentioned AI, there are lots, as people are trying to train up machine learning algorithms, for example, they need big chunks of data. And so there's already this emerging market for companies that can provide data that could even train up AIs, essentially. But getting back to what you were saying about the recommendations, it's my understanding in your content experience report that you even found out how you could, what's most effective when it comes to recommending the next piece of content for people who have already found some value in the content you're providing? Yeah,
so I'll kind of hit on two different findings in answering that question. Cool. And just that way, those listening, if you don't have a platform, that has AI recommendations yet, and you're just trying to figure out how to hack away at this, I'll give you a baby step funding, and then kind of like the bigger, bolder, all right, let's leverage AI. Yep. So one of the simpler ones was just thinking about the way we consume content, right? And to do that, we have to think about what do we go to a site and what do we look for, right? And one of the things that a lot of companies do is they organize their content in the way they create it, right? And, just before jumping on this podcast, I was, in a meeting with our internal videographer, and we were talking all about our video strategy, but that's a format of content, right? Like we, just because we're creating videos doesn't mean that we're going to have a part on our website here that's all of our videos, right? Because people don't come to Uberflip and say, okay, I want to understand what you guys do. Show me some videos, right? They say, all right, I'm coming to Uberflip because I heard you guys do something to do with content experience. So either I want to understand what content experience is, or I understand that you can help me generate more leads. My challenge or my topic is lead generation. So they don't come to us and say, show me ebooks or show me videos or show me blog posts. They say, I have this problem. I want you to solve it for me, right? But back to what a lot of us do is that we format or we set up our site, we set up our experiences very much by format, right? And we're all guilty of this. Like go to your knowledge base or resource center, or content hub, whatever you call it. Even go to your main homepage and go to that drop down menu, and it's like drop down and it's like ebooks, videos,
white papers, blog.
Yeah,
as you're saying this, I'm like, oh my God, you're totally right.
Yeah, it's embarrassing, but we all do it, right? Like, it's okay. Like, 10 years ago, we were all getting in taxi cabs before Uber made it better. So we're all guilty of falling into bad habits, right?
Yep.
And we have to find ways to break through that because people don't come and look for content in that way. Like some of us actually have infographic tabs. Right? It's like, you really think people are going to be like, okay, let me see their infographics. I'm going to figure out what these guys do, or maybe I'll find a gem of an infographic.
Right.
Debatable if infographics were ever a good choice, but but the point here is that if we organize content by topic instead of format, we found in the data that people had 2 times the amount of views of their content. Right? Like double the amount of views of content when we move to the way people are looking for content. Like, as I said, this is research that came from our data science team, but it's not rocket science, right? It makes sense that that's what people are looking for when they come to our site. So how do we start to organize? And that's why I call that baby step. Like, do the things to really understand what do your people want. And you're probably writing content in that way. You're probably saying, okay, here are our personas, here are the challenges. But when it comes to experience, remember, we talked at the beginning of the podcast, we get so caught up on creation, we ignore the experience. All we end up doing is we click publish, and it's on our site, and we hope people will figure out how to navigate on their own.
Yeah.
Right? That's a big problem. Does that one make sense before I go?
Oh, yeah, no, totally. In fact, you got me thinking differently about, even what you're really saying is the way you organize and present your content is itself a form of recommendation. Like it's a soft recommendation engine. And by if you're interested in this topic, here's where you can go to find more about this topic. And I think you're absolutely right. No one cares at that level about the format. They care about what it's actually talking about. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, the world is not going to be taken over by robots anytime soon, in my opinion, right? Like, they're coming, the robots, but we don't want a Will Smith iRobot situation to happen here. It's a balance of art and science that we need here, right? Yeah. The art is the marketer. That's where our jobs, they're still safe. We're not going anywhere. We will be here. The science is the AI. And, I'll give you a great example that has nothing to do with B2B. It's much more in our consumer lives. We all use it. It's Spotify. Right? Spotify to me does an amazing job at, first of all, recommending content, curating content for us. All the content in there, they're not even creating content per se. Yeah. They're finding all the best content. But the cool part about it, and I don't know if you've ever noticed these words, I love them. When you open up the Spotify app, it says made for name, right? So if you open it up, it says made for Matt. If I open it up, it's made for Randy. Yep. And right there, I'm like, oh my God, this is made for me. I'm really intrigued, right? Yeah. That's what we need to deliver as an experience to our customers. It needs to feel made for them.
Right.
Now, the reality is, we may be listening to very similar music or very different. They're pulling from all their same content assets. And the way that happens, don't get me wrong, there's a huge degree of data science, and there's algorithms running in the background to make that happen. But Spotify actually has a team that does manually tag content for, and when in the word content in this case, it's obviously music or it's podcasts like this one, that that allow their algorithm to go in and best recommend for us. But it does require, again, that art to say, okay, they know this content's going to appeal to this type of genre or this type of audience and whatnot. And that's what we need to do. We need to, again, take those baby steps, organize by the topics, and then layer in AI, and then layer in data and recommendations, to get the right content to people on the fly, right? And that's how we're going to scale these things. What we found is, again, this data came from Uberflip customers. So we have an AI component to our platform that leverages third-party data to make recommendations of content based on trending and surging topics. So we partner with a company called Bombora. We leverage their data inside of our platform so that even if we don't know who you are, we don't, we're not tracking your pixel or anything at this point per se in terms of like the cookie that's been left inside of a marketing automation system. And sorry if I'm getting too technical, but we can still start to make content recommendations.
Yep.
So that was the type of data that we were able to leverage. And the cool part was that we saw 8x more engagement to that next piece of content where recommendation was pulled into play, right? Now that's amazing, right? Like we're starting to layer these things on top of each other where we have 2 times more when we do it by topic. We've got 8 times more when we start to do smart recommendations on the fly. When we're gating content, we go to 7x return. Yep. So it's all these little hacks that are all coming from the numbers, right? They're all coming from data, but the key again is we've got to be able to map this entire buyer journey to understand that.
Yeah, and it's all using this data again to really kind of put our money where our mouths are in terms of being customer centric and adapting what we're doing to customer behaviors, customer attention, customer desires. And rather than forcing them, which is what most companies do, to suss out, okay, how's this site set up and what do I have to learn about this organization of content so I can actually find what I'm looking for. So, Randy, we're at the end of our time, but I did want to give you one opportunity here at the end just to give a shout out. You got this book. What's the title and where can people find it?
So first off, thanks for that opportunity. It's
Sure.
Very nice of you. So the book comes out, it's pretty much out right now by the time this podcast goes live, and it is called Content Marketing. I apologize for it. I'm actually...
Excuse me?
Yeah, exactly. I'm actually going on an 8-city tour. It's called ConX. Content Experience. And we're starting, early March to all these cities. And I have to give this keynote, and the keynote is called Content Marketing. So what I've done is I'm bringing a swear jar with me, and every time I drop the F-bomb, I will, at the end, there's going to be someone on my team who counts the number of times I do it in the keynote, and I will be dropping money into the swear jar, and it will be going to Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto. So, I am trying to make good. I'm trying to be the good, father that I really, truly am.
Yes.
But still, we had to make a point, right? We touched on this at the beginning, Matt, right? Yeah. The idea here is not that content marketing is bad, right? It's not that we shouldn't create content anymore, but it's this idea that we're creating way too much content that's not getting used or it's not being surfaced for our audience to find. And that's, so the subtitle of the book is a little softer. It's focus on content experience to drive revenue, demand, and relationships. In terms of where to find the book, you can go to Amazon and order it there. Or if you want to learn more, if you go to b-rand.com, as in brand. A lot of my friends call me Rand, not Randy. So that's the site. b-rand.com. You can get the book, my podcast, and a whole bunch of other fun content.
Right, cool. All right, Randy. Well, it was really great talking to you. The time flew by, and I just really appreciate you being on the Intelligent Business Show.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Next week, we'll be talking with Cheryl Schultz, founder and president at Cabinet M. We'll be talking specifically about the marketing stack and how to build one. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intelligent Business Show. You can find this show on iTunes and Spotify, as well as on YouTube. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at Aberdeen_show. And if you want to know what's going on in your market space, be sure to check out Aberdeen.com.